All right, welcome everyone. This has been such a thrilling day. I'm gonna have the pleasure of moderating a panel discussion with speakers from our morning session. We have Dr. Smit, Dr. Neacsiu, Dr. Gregory, and Dr. Ward here. And I'm Sylvie Raver. I'm with the Milken Institute Center for Strategic Philanthropy. Since 2019, our team has been working with the REAM Foundation to establish and provide scientific leadership for the Misophonia Research Fund. And it's really exciting to see so many funded investigators here sharing their research. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of this. Thank you for joining us. For those that have questions for a specific speaker, I will ask that you please just indicate maybe the speaker's last name in your question at the top so that we can make sure they get to the right person. If they're just more of a general question, and I can do some inference about which speaker should answer them, I'll do my best, but I want to make sure that we field questions to the right folks. So do me a favor and do that as well. I'd love to kick us off with just sort of a general question for everyone, because the real focus of today is about providing hope, distilling research so that people can understand it and it can be really impactful for their lives. So I'd love to start with each of you asking if you think that misophonia can be eliminated or just managed throughout someone's life. Is it possible to completely ameliorate the symptoms that people experience, or are we not quite there yet? So maybe I will start with Dr. Gregory, who sits in the therapeutic space, in the treatment space, and get her take first.
Hi, yeah. Is my sound okay? I just realized we didn't do a sound check or anything. Good. Yeah, I don't think it can be eliminated. I don't think that's possible or even necessarily what we need, but I do think that we can change the level of distress that it causes people and definitely change the impact that it has for people and help people to manage. But I think that there are also some strategies that can really change the nature of your relationship with sounds, that can reduce how bad it feels when you're around those sounds.
Dr. Neacsiu, same question for you. Based on your preliminary evidence with neurostimulation and cognitive training techniques, what do you think? Eliminated or just managed?
I mean, it's so hard. It's so early in the game to tell. My hope would be that we can find ways to. My goal would be to keep researching until we find ways to eradicate it. I don't know that we can get there, but that's something that I think we can hope to try to achieve. Especially the more we understand how it develops and what it exactly it is. I don't think we have to give up hope that it can be fully eradicated. I don't have the answer of how we're going to get there quite yet.
Building off of Dr. Ward's research, which is using some really sophisticated methods to detect thresholds, Dr. Ward, do you think that we could eventually predict who develops misophonia based on reactivity to specific sounds or types of sounds?
That's a really good question. I think that might be possible. Yeah, it's a question of whether kids can give reliable ratings on these sorts of methods. Even with fancy machine learning, you're still relying on a human to make reliable judgments about these and kind of in that way. So that there are these limitations, but I think identifying early signs of misophonia, I think is going to be a key part of the research agenda. And I think a mixed bag of methods is probably going to be the right way forward.
Dr. Smit, do you see a path for genetics to be any part of that mixed bag?
Yeah, definitely. So genetics is never a good combination for eradication of things. I don't think we should start breeding out misophonia symptoms or misophonia as a disorder. I mean, genetics is not useful for that. The way I see genetics could help is, for example, in personalized treatment, or at least to figure out how there's heterogeneity in the disorder that would be linked to a heterogeneous or differential treatment, so that you can, get to treatment results better and maybe even earlier. So that would be my guess for the future.
More of the prevention strategy.
Yeah, so well, the correct response in the personalized treatment, not everybody should, the same treatment will work exactly the same way. Maybe different brain areas should be targeted depending on the subtyping of misophonia.
Got it.
And
that was relevant to Dr. Neacsiu's talk that we just heard. Could each of you talk a little, or Dr. Ward, actually, I want to put this question to you a little bit. Links between misophonia and ASMR. Dr. Smit showed some interesting genetics data there, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in your work.
Yeah, so there are a few studies that when you give people questionnaires around misophonia and ASMR that you do find a positive association. I think a lot of those questions are kind of worded about having an intense experience with sounds and physiological reactions with sound. So I think that the similarity is kind of, it looks like there should be something there, and people say there's something there, but actually when we try to look at it, we don't find any sounds that misophonics like. There are some that they're fairly neutral about, but we find plenty of sounds that people with ASMR like. They have the tingling and so on. We do find some people who say that they have ASMR and misophonia, and then when we look at their kind of response to the sound, they look like people with ASMR and they don't look like people with misophonia, which doesn't say I don't believe them, but it's certainly a fly in the ointment in terms of this. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the relationship between ASMR and misophonia, aside from something very generic like an intense response to sounds.
We just had a question submitted. What similarity, if any, is there between response to trigger sounds among people with misophonia and trauma response? So this is a bit more clinically focused. Might there be similar treatments? Who would like to take that one?
I could talk a little about that. I think there's a few really interesting points to this. I'll try not to keep talking about it for too long, but one is that I've seen people develop sort of transient misophonia type symptoms following a traumatic event, and that's a really natural response from the brain to tune into particular sounds that might be linked to the trauma in some way, and it's a protective mechanism to try and protect you from future trauma. But if that gets stuck, then some types of PTSD type treatment can help to improve that overreaction to particular sounds. I've also seen people who have both PTSD and misophonia, and we treat both of them together because they're often very interlinked. And then there's another aspect to it, which is what we call sort of small t trauma. So events where your emotional needs weren't met that were experienced as traumatic, but we wouldn't put them into the category of trauma in a PTSD type sense, and that can be related to misophonia specifically. So for example, if you're having a really distressing reaction to a sound at the dinner table and then you're shouted at for overreacting, then you can develop a heightened response to sounds, because now you're not just experiencing the reaction to the sound, but you're also experiencing part of the memory, the echo of that memory of being shouted at or ignored or dismissed. And those emotional experiences can kind of attach themselves to the misophonia reaction. So I talk about it forever, I'll stop, but yeah, I find it fascinating. It's a great question.
I want to make sure that anyone else can share their thoughts if they want to before I go on to the next question. Another one, a little bit more on therapy, and I know that this has been a controversial topic in the misophonia space. Is anyone aware of attempts to treat misophonia with exposure therapy and/or success at habituation, as with OCD? Who would like to take that one? I see Dr. Neacsiu nodding. I'm not sure this is your full wheelhouse, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I haven't. I mean, I've clinically dabbled in trying all sorts of things with a few patients with misophonia that I've treated in clinic, and I've steered away from exposure because it didn't respond very well to that. I haven't seen a full-blown study about it, but there's way more experts in the room that might have seen that and I didn't. I would say that to the finding that I was talking about, that inhibiting reactivity seemed to work a little less than promoting regulation. That might speak to that, because a way to inhibit reactivity is to do exposure. That's a behavioral way of reducing reactivity to something. And the fact that we've seen that doing that didn't lead to less distress, again, to me, again, small study, we need to replicate it and try it in different ways, but to me, it seemed to suggest that potentially other avenues to treatment would be better to try first than exposure.
I think it's also really important to distinguish between treatment that involves some exposure to sounds and treatment where the purpose of the exposure is to get used to the sounds. And I think that the latter, for most people, it won't happen. And for some people, if they've got a high anxiety response, there's a possibility, but I don't think it's worth trying because of the potential for it to cause damage rather than to help. But I do think that for therapy for misophonia, it will often involve using sounds as part of therapy, but not with the intention to get used to the sounds, but more with the intention, similar to what you were saying, Andrada, about learning regulation skills or changing the nature of your relationship to sounds. And in therapy, we would usually do that very short, so maybe 30 seconds at a time, and working on a specific strategy during that exposure.
Dr. Rosenthal, I see you came off camera. Do you want to jump in on this one too? Oh, do we have your audio?
Sorry, yes, hi. Real quickly, just to jump in on this point, and the past point about trauma. One way to think about exposure is that it is only habituation-based, traditional, kind of old school desensitization. Another way to think about exposure is not that. There are actually different ways to think about it. And some of the newer and more promising ways of doing exposure don't involve habituation. They involve, it's called inhibitory learning, and it's essentially a way to learn to do a bit more of what Jane just described. It's sort of approaching the kind of situation where the unpleasant stimulus might be in, and not just simply sitting there and habituating, but actively engaging in the approach in a way that helps you regulate and manage and develop a new way of responding, and develop new expectations around what might happen should you encounter those kinds of cues. And actually that type of exposure, again, inhibitory learning exposure, pieces of that can be found in a number of the promising interventions for misophonia that have begun to be developed across a number of different research teams. So the takeaway there is we shouldn't think of exposure therapy as simply only habituation based. And then quickly, the thought on trauma, we've got a paper under review right now from our Duke Center on this. And real quick, what we asked was, is PTSD related to misophonia? Is the diagnosis, are the symptoms, and are adverse life experiences related to misophonia? Or is it stress overall, perceptions of stress, independent of trauma and traumatic stress? And the answer was the latter, not the former. We're not finding PTSD as a diagnosis, or PTSD symptoms, or early life trauma is uniquely related to misophonia. We are finding that perceived stress is related to. So maybe stress reactions, not necessarily trauma reactions, but this is, of course, just one study.
I just want to add to the exposure thing. In the UK, we don't do habituation. Like that's not how we do therapy in the UK. So cognitive behavior therapy isn't taught that way here. So we don't really use habituation for anything. So when we think of exposure therapy, we mean experiments and inhibitory learning and things like that. So even for a simple phobia, we're usually testing something. We're not trying to get you used to the thing that you're scared of. So it's not really an approach here.
That's very helpful. So much interest in what to do about misophonia for obvious reasons. I'd like to pose a question to Dr. Ward first, talking about context for triggers. Why sometimes there is a person who becomes the main trigger person. Is it a selective disorder? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it has puzzled me. I mean, one of the things that we've recently asked our misophonics is how much this applies to them. Typically what people will say is that one person is worse, but actually it's most people, if not everybody. But there is about 10% of people who insist it is just one person who is the trigger. Now, whether these people do have a different profile in terms of comorbidities, in terms of the kinds of tests we're doing, I don't know. But those people who say it's one person and one person only are quite rare, but they are out there. I'm not denying that. For most people, it's one person might be somewhat worse. And again, their family members, it might be to do with the sound. But I think it's more their interpretation of the sound, that this person is doing it to wind them up and that they're being inconsiderate. And there are kind of layers to this in terms of how people interpret the agent of the sound.
We're at 10 minutes.
A follow-on question for you, and then I want to ask for sure, Dr. Neacsiu, this as well. How do you approximate that? How do you study that in the lab? How do you make sure that the triggers are specific enough for a person?
Well, I was kind of curious when others have said that they gave 100 sounds. Are they finding what we're finding, that actually most sounds are actually disliked by people with misophonia, and it's going to be quite hard to find sounds that are equated in terms of their level of dislike, because that's been our experience, and that actually that we don't collect personalized sounds. We don't go to people's homes and ask their sister to start slurping or this sort of thing. Whether or not that's appropriate, I'm not sure that it is necessarily. I mean, there are other studies where you play the same sound, but in one case you say, you know, this is an adult doing it or this is a child, and even that will change the misophonic reaction to it. So it's about your perceptions and your beliefs about the sound that really kind of can take it through the roof.
Let's talk a little bit about comorbidities. Dr. Smit, this was some of the research that you presented this morning, possible relationship between misophonia and other types of conditions. So I'd love your thoughts on what you think might be some of the most promising links based on what we've seen so far. And then I have a follow-on question for additional panelists.
Yeah, so much of what we have been doing on genetics has been, you know, prompted by the comorbidity research that's been done at the Amsterdam University Medical Center, with a couple of disorders jumping out. I've been talking this morning about obsessive compulsive personality disorders that were comorbid to some of the misophonia patients that come into our institute, that we couldn't follow up, but we didn't see any relationship with genetically, I have to say, with OCD. Neither did we for many other disorders. What we did see, and that might be very interesting, a genetic relationship with PTSD. So there was well, it was a significant correlation. It wasn't like the largest positive genetic correlation that we're talking about. But what we have to understand is that this is a relationship in genetics. So it's the propensity to have PTSD in your genes is then correlated to the genetics of people who've answered the question on a population-based sample, the 23andMe people who answered the question. And so that's a really interesting thing to see, that if you have this propensity for this genetics, for PTSD, then you also have the increased risk, or genetic risk, I have to say, for misophonia. So the nature of this overlap, we haven't studied specifically, but I think we just heard some hints of what this type of relationship might be. So it might be some, what was it, sensitivity to stress, I think, was the interpretation of the symptom overlap between PTSD and misophonia, and that might be actually reflected in the genetic overlap as well. Also talked about the relationship with autism spectrum disorder, the genetics, and that one turned out to be very surprising, namely a slight negative correlation that we found.
Yeah.
that is something we have to really look at and see how we can explain this negative correlation in terms of neurobiological substance.
Absolutely.
We're at 5 minutes.
Sounds good. Well, that sort of takes me to, I'd love to ask, if not a final question, a question for each of you to touch on so that we can give our participants some next steps. And so coming off of that, needing to continue study of genetic analyses, which requires really large sample sizes, beyond the obvious, which is donating funds for research, how can this misophonia community support the research of people such as yourselves? So let's start with Dr. Smit, who needs massive numbers of folks to do some of these genome-wide association studies. So what can folks do to support your research?
Well, I think one of the questions after my talk was where can I help out and participate in the study for the genetics. That would be great. So I first have to get some funding to get the genotyping done. And then it's a long-term thing that we want to do in genetics, of course. I mean, these studies have been accumulating over 10, well, maybe 15 years now, and the numbers that we need for our studies are very, very big. So it's incremental funding that we need for this. But we are planning on getting some 1,500 misophonia cases in our institution genotyped when we have applied for funding for them. That will be a great first start to do that. Well, so we're applying for the funds, and I hope we get more, and we can actually.
Folks should stay tuned for a recruitment link to participate in those studies. It sounds like similar to Dr. Neacsiu, you do much smaller scale studies. We're very targeted, individualized. What can folks do to participate in those and support your next step of research?
So I've been blown away, and I'm excited to continue in this field because of how supportive the community was when I started. We recruited the misophonia arm of the study as a new scientist in the area that had no idea what they were doing very quickly. I think I so appreciate the enthusiasm for research and people's willingness to fly across the country and come try something, very esoteric for research. So continuing involvement in research, I think, is great. Outside of that, I think if you're willing to try one of the evidence-based treatments that are based on neuromodulation, write me and tell me how it's going. I'm curious to kind of learn. Those are available in the community. A lot of them are actually covered by insurance. And we don't have that data, not even anecdotally, like how would someone with misophonia respond to the OCD treatment or the depression treatment. So, short of us being able to do that research, I think giving it a shot and seeing what happens and letting us know about it, that would be another way to help.
Great. Dr. Ward, you shared briefly at the end of your talk the University of Sussex and the group there has created so many resources for the community. How can the community continue engaging with those like the Misophonia Hub?
Yeah, we are always looking for participants, as other research groups are, so you can volunteer. We do surveys as well as in-person studies. But I think also we're interested in your feedback. What questions should we be asking? We've all got our own speciality and so, but we do want it to be relevant. And, people with misophonia are a diverse group. You're not all going to be exactly the same. And I think it's important that we're aware of these differences and try to understand and capture them.
Excellent. So feedback. Last word to you, Dr. Gregory. You're so out in the community, aside from telling everybody to go buy your book on pre-order. What other things can folks do to advocate and engage and continue supporting the misophonia field?
Well, it's sort of along those lines. I think one of the biggest and most important things is sharing information. That there's now increased, like every year we're having so much more information about misophonia available from research, and it's really hard to break through from our little misophonia bubble out into the rest of the community. And so if you're science savvy, then write a blog post about a research paper that you've read, or just share a post that you've seen, or take a paper to your health professional, because there are still so many health professionals who don't know anything about misophonia, and then the more they hear the word, the more they'll be forced to take it seriously. So yeah, that's my main thing, is just talk about it, and talk about it a lot.
Get that awareness percentage up, bump it up. Thank you, everybody. The talks this morning were fantastic. We're going to break, I believe, for an hour for lunch or dinner, depending on where you are in the world. Look forward to seeing everyone in the afternoon sessions.